Hello, I'm Stephen LeBlanc from the Department of Population Medicine at the Ontario Veterinary College. I'd like to share with you a brief synopsis of some of the work that we have ongoing from dairy at Guelph related to antimicrobial stewardship in the dairy industry. As you've probably heard in the news or elsewhere, the problem of disease and infections in people caused by bacteria that are resistant to the drugs, the antibiotics that are used to treat them, is a problem of increasing prevalence and importance in human health. There have been a number of well-publicized outbreaks of antibiotic-resistant disease, and the prevalence of this problem and overall global importance of this problem is projected to increase substantially in the years ahead. The reasons for which antibiotic resistance develops are complex and certainly multifactorial. And it's true that in the long run, any and all use of antibiotics will eventually contribute to the development of resistance against those drugs. But it's been noticed that the total mass of antibiotics used in the world is disproportionately used in animal agriculture. A number of steps have already been taken to reduce that, and in any case, the dairy industry was a relatively small proportion of that use. However, animal agriculture in general, and the dairy industry included, are under scrutiny and some pressure to take stock of our use of antibiotics and to do our part to reduce resistance in animals and people. We don't face substantial problems of untreatable disease in our dairy cows and calves, but nevertheless, to the extent that this is that what we do in dairy production may contribute to resistance in people, we do have to deal with the problem. And to do that, we need to understand it better. Antibiotic resistance will always happen eventually, and it happens by two main routes. Drug use, antibiotic drug use in people may select for resistance in people, and that may spread within hospitals or the community. Antimicrobial use, even rational and justified use for therapy in sick animals, will in the long run contribute to the emergence of at least some resistant bacteria, which can then spread through the food chain or possibly through environmental contamination to result in exposure to people. Even though those bacteria may not themselves cause disease, they may in turn pass on their resistance elements to bacteria that do cause disease. And it's very difficult to know exactly to what extent use and practice and even resistance among animals contributes to the resistance that exists in people. It seems that what we do in the dairy industry is likely to be a relatively small proportion of that total global problem. Nevertheless, it's incumbent on us to understand that as best we can and to do our part and to be seen to be doing our part in a rational way to reduce the contribution that may come from antimicrobial use in dairy cows. And so the University of Guelph is home to some of the leaders in the country and indeed globally in understanding the epidemiology and in formulating policies around antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial stewardship, which is to say the development and implementation of rational and effective policies and practices to look after animal health on the one hand, but to reduce the emergence of antibiotic resistance on the other. So Dairy at Guelph researchers are presently working on at least three prongs of research. The first is understanding what is being done. There are data from a number of other countries, but not a lot of good recent data in the Canadian dairy industry as to exactly which drugs are being used for what reasons and in what amounts. And that's obviously important to inform our steps going forward. Presently, and over the last year, we've had 30 dairy farms in Ontario working on a project with a number of Dairy at Guelph members to collect their treatment records and also participate in a so-called garbage can audit, where they collect all the bottles and containers for antibiotics that they use on their farms, and we can use that then to develop an accurate description of what is being used and associate that a little bit with some of the farm demographics. At the same time, and in a typical example of some of our broader collaborations, this is contributing to a much larger national study with many more farms, which also includes sampling of fecal samples, manure samples from the environment to actually measure the amount of resistant bacteria on the farm. A second prong, going from the what to the why, is understanding some of the social science aspects, the psychological aspects, if you will, of how dairy farmers make their antibiotic use decisions. So this involves using qualitative research to understand their attitudes, their knowledge, their motivations, their thought processes that go into making antibiotic use decisions. We were able to complete a series of focus groups with dairy farmers in Ontario and New Brunswick just before the COVID lockdowns occurred. And in those, we gathered groups of 5 to 8 farmers for structured discussions to ask them questions and get them talking about some of the factors so that we could understand their decision-making processes, their opinions, their attitudes, what their reference were, where they got their information, and generally how they thought about working through the process of making treatment decisions. That's led to some of our preliminary work, which is just in the process of heading out for publication. There were a number of themes that go into the complex layers and nuances of how farmers make these decisions, including where they get information from, what their baseline knowledge level of antimicrobial resistance was, to what extent they perceive this to be a problem, and identifying some of their willingness and also some of their barriers and concerns to how they might change their antimicrobial use if they were asked to or even required to in the future. That's been really fruitful in generating a number of hypotheses and further questions, and we're going to continue this line of research with an industry-wide survey which will go live very shortly in the last month of 2020. An online survey will be made available to all dairy farmers in Ontario and ask a series of questions about their animal health practices, but in particular probe additionally, informed by what we learned in the focus groups, to better understand what their thought processes and practices are around antimicrobial stewardship. In parallel, we'll undertake some similar work with veterinarians working in the dairy industry to be able to compare and contrast some of their reference, opinions, attitudes, and approaches to antimicrobial usage to better inform how we might develop strategies to achieve rational and effective antimicrobial stewardship. Which leads to our third prong of research, which will unfold through 2021 and into 2022, and that's to develop and test some interventions, specifically around selective dry cow therapy. So this is certainly an effective way to reduce the total amount of antibiotic used on a dairy farm, and it can be very successful on some farms, but there's still more we need to understand about how to implement this in the most effective way. Also, based on what we learned in the focus groups and from the survey, we're going to develop an intervention study where some farms will have an intervention informed by what we learned about how dairy farmers think about and approach antibiotic treatment decisions, with the goal to reduce their use, and in particular reduce their use of antibiotics that are critically important for human health. But in both of these studies, we not only want to look at the effects on use, but also the effects on animal health and animal performance, because those are critically important to maintain as we think about implementing better stewardship. Finally, we have a number of projects in the proposal pipeline to develop and test early intervention strategies using precision technologies, specifically automated data coming from automated calf feeders, and also sensors worn by fresh cows in the postpartum period to measure activity and rumination, for example. We'll use these data in somewhat novel ways to identify early signs of disease and test interventions that don't involve the use of antibiotics. Again, looking for the outcomes not only to potentially reduce antibiotic use, but to do so in a way that maintains or even enhances animal health and performance. With that, I invite you to keep up with what we're doing and the results of this and all of our other research on our dairy@guelph.ca website and through some of our social media channels where we push out updates on our latest projects and results.
The research projects that I've told you about here have been generously supported by our partners. In this case, the Dairy Cluster 3, supported by Dairy Farmers of Canada, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, as well as by Dairy Farmers of Ontario and the Food from Thought Research Program at the University of Guelph.